Everyone, I'm super excited to be presenting for this conference at the Sorbonne in Paris in 2025 in what I'm calling a return to the Sorbonne. And this is called the UNIQUEWAYS podcast report. So I'll give you some background first. So the UNIQUEWAYS podcasts are described as emerging with people from all walks of life with their own unique angle, succeed and flourish. Enjoy the ride and welcome to UNIQUEWAYS, an audio podcast. They were inspired by a workshop called Unique Ways of Prototyping, which started as a workshop built around a method called role play, which uses voice and writing to make, test, and iterate an idea. Participants are paired up and assigned roles. One person represents a user, and one person represents a product or service that is interrogated by that user. So, for example, we might say the product or service is a voice user interface like Siri. And so when the roles are assigned, they have a conversation based on their roles. So in this case, it's a person who represents a user of Siri and a person who represents Siri, and they just talk to each other. And this often happens for a timed interval of 10 minutes. After the 10 minutes is up, the second half of the workshop begins. And in the same pairs, they have a similar conversation, but focused on a variation of the product or the service. The workshop concludes with the takeaway idea. Next time, try this not just in pairs, but in groups of three, where the third person is a note taker who just listens to the interactive conversation between the pair and turns it into writing. And in addition to voice user interfaces, this can easily be adapted to interrogate relationships between users and mobile devices or within more pioneering technologies like VR and AR. That brings us into my new framework, which I want to introduce today. And it's called UX Now, the User Experience Training Program. And I'd like to go into a week by week of the program. So week one is about generating ideas and editing them down. And we call this process affinity diagramming, which involves using sticky notes to create, discard, and create again in a convergent and divergent model. As an alternative modality, we can use index cards or letter-sized paper for these ideas, and we assign value and time indicators to the ideas to help us better understand them. We go into week two, which is around wireframing, but in an analog way. So we use tools like Crazy Eights and simple pen and paper and begin to make sense of our ideas in terms of how they relate to technology. We will create relationships between screens or stills and create some narrative aspects of the deliverables. A basic step forward in simply making ideas visible is building some coherent value into these ideas. Week three is about paper prototyping, which is a low fidelity way of making and creating and building a working version of your idea. We'll begin by creating a prototype as a first stage of beginning to understand that what we make is for someone else. And this process taps into the ideas around empathy and target audience. And this, in essence, builds your entrepreneurial aspect into your deliverables because you're making a product or service for someone else. And ideas around value proposition design, especially around the strategizer book, will be introduced. Week four takes a bit of bravery and trust in the process, and it's about beginning, making, testing, and iterating on a model. With our early paper prototypes, we begin to get some initial feedback and then immediately implement the feedback in order to better understand and serve our audience. And so we do this followed by more testing and iterating. And we continue this process for as long as we have time for or until we run out of time. Week five is about the reality these days that deliverables require a certain level of fidelity in order to give them to stakeholders and gain buy-in. And so this week is spent creating deliverables in high fidelity using tools like Figma or slide decks in Google Slides or portfolios hosted by a CMS, for example, WordPress, or using simple still graphics in Photoshop to serve as a conversation piece that can be shown as a process endpoint before a next major iterative cycle occurs. And that is essentially the breakdown. There's a class structure, which is a four-part thing. The first part is called head dump. It's an inspiration sharing session meant to share whatever you have come across in your work or life during that week. And then part 2 is called presentation. Each day, a presentation slide deck of relevant topics is shown to kickstart and educate and kind of build a structure. Part 3 is called workshop time. We face the reality that homework is an old-fashioned idea, and we work in class on our projects for a time, and this often works with working collaboratively. And finally, we go into critiques. We show each other our work and rigorously ask for feedback to implement the feedback. The only required tech for this is the ability to connect to Wi-Fi with a MacBook that's running Figma or Creative Cloud, Google Slides, and then preferably an iPhone so that you have the camera and you can upload the photos of the low fidelity deliverables. And some assistance is provided in operating all of these. And the recommended reading is Value Proposition Design and The Design of Everyday Things by Donald Norman. And that's kind of it. That's where I am with UNIQUEWAYS podcast report and the Inspired Framework UX Now. I hope you can make sense of these and utilize them in your own practice. Thank you.